Leadership is often painted as power, control, and commanding authority. But what if the real story of leadership is about humility, service, and the simple act of catching people doing things right? Let's have ourselves a pocket sized pep talk and explore the life of Ken Blanchard. And you're going to get a powerful reminder that nice guys don't just finish first, they change lives.
A Pocket Sized Pep Talk, the podcast that can help energize your business and your life with a quick, inspiring message. Now, here's your host, Rob Jollis.
Today's guest, Martha Lawrence, is a veteran book editor and the executive editor at Blanchard, where she worked side by side with Ken Blanchard for over 2 decades. She's edited hundreds of books, including Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, and co-authored Trust Works with Blanchard. She's also the author of an award-nominated mystery series and a passionate advocate for leading with kindness and purpose. Catch People Doing Things Right: How Ken Blanchard Changed the Way the World Leads is her latest book, and we're going to talk about it. Happy to have you with us, and welcome to the show, Martha.
Rob, it is just an honor to be with you today. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Well, I am too, because before we even pressed record, I was already fawning over Ken Blanchard. I really have a great deal of respect. I'll tell you that story maybe in a minute or two, but I want to start with you and Ken Blanchard. You worked with him for 20 years. Was there a specific turning point when you knew Ken's story had to be told in full?
There was, Rob. There was a specific turning point. And, I'm a big fan. I've been in publishing for a long time. I love biographies. I love reading them. And I was reading stories about business scions like Steve Jobs and Elon Musk and Jack Welch and all these amazing guys. And they've lived these incredible lives. But the thing is, they're not necessarily great role models. And after working with Ken side by side for over 20 years, not only was he teaching all this amazing stuff about people-centered leadership and, the purpose of business is to serve, not to be served, but he was actually living those principles. And it was like somebody has to tell the story about someone who is successful and they didn't cheat to win and they didn't have ruthless ambition, but they were just always putting other people first. And yet they achieved the pinnacle of success. And that is possible. You don't have to be a jerk to win.
Which is so refreshing to hear, because I am an obscenely half full person and I really want to believe the best in people. And my dad used to kid me, because he said, you're just letting people take advantage of you. And I would look at him as a 13-year-old say, but only the first time. But I just didn't want to go into scenarios thinking the worst of people. I wanted to think the best of people. And if you get me once, but you don't get me twice. But who wants to live a life the other way, thinking that everybody's not sincere? But Ken Blanchard, there's a guy who truly walks the walk. And Martha, could I just quickly tell you my quick Ken Blanchard story? Then I'll be out of Ken Blanchard stories, but I'm sure you get one from everybody. Mine goes like this. I was writing I think it was my 5th book, and I was getting testimonials. And my publisher, Barrett Kohler, sort of had a connection, and they said, well, we're going to try and see if we can get Ken Blanchard to write a testimonial. And I was shaking in my shoes like, Ken Blanchard, that's incredible. And then I became a part of the machinery, and I realized, oh, yes, he'll consider it after he reads the entire manuscript, which I'd never heard of before. But that's what a person of principle does. You see, most of us, and even I cheat a little bit. I'm not a big cheater, but I get a lot of requests for testimonials, and I want to look at the cliff notes. I want to help me get started. Not Ken Blanchard. Read the whole thing, and he wrote a quote to this day that is not only the nicest quote I ever saw. I could not write a better quote for my own book than Ken Blanchard, because he read it, studied it, and worked hard on it. That meant a great deal to me.
Classic Ken Blanchard story. Thank you for telling that story. And, getting back to what you said about what your dad told you about don't let people take advantage of you. So, this is Ken's flaw, is that he is almost too nice. That's what was hard about writing this book, because how do you write a captivating story about somebody who's just so nice all the time? But getting back to your story about your dad, when somebody would do something that hurt Ken or took advantage of him, I'd say, Ken, how do you feel about that? And he'd say, they get the life that goes with that.
Hmm,
They get the life that goes with that. And he did the same thing as you. Dust off your shoes. It's not going to change how I behave toward people.
right.
So yeah, yeah. So
So classic. All right, let's go back to the 80s a little bit. And we're talking about the 1 Minute Manager, which we all read. It was everywhere. Uh, in your view, why? What made it such a big hit?
in my view, well, I was a young editor when that book hit in 1982, and you're right, it was everywhere. And it's hard for, I think, listeners today, back in the day when there were like six major publishers, if a book hit the bestseller list, everybody was reading it. And that book was on the bestseller list for 3 years straight. I mean, it was in every window face out, and even in TV shows and all that. My opinion of what made it a success is that Ken Blanchard and his co author, Spencer Johnson, did something unheard of back in the day. Business books were at that time big, heavy, boring tomes, that went deep into theory and analysis. And Ken and Spencer wrote a parable about a young man who was looking for a good manager. And there were three secrets to being a good manager, and they were simple to remember: set goals, praise progress, catch people doing things right, and redirect. We call it redirect now instead of reprimand. But that the book was so simple, you could, as the publisher said, it's a bathtub book. You draw your bath, you've got the warm water, you get in the bathtub, and you start reading the book in the bathtub, and by the time the water is cold, you're done. And that was just revolutionary, and it launched a whole genre of business books, the business parable.
Right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
actually heard one time I was not complaining, but I was whining because I was looking at Johnson's book. Remember, when you're jealous, you get to know Johnson. Okay. As a matter of fact, the good news is if I ever wanted to find my book, I'd look for the 25 Johnsons and I'd look to the left. Okay. So that's how I got to know it. But I said, I don't even know if this is a book. What do we call this? How do you, and he said it was a book fable. It was a business fable.
Business fable.
And it opened my eyes and actually softened up my writing a little bit to say, you mean we can write a business book and make it an enjoyable read it, that we don't have to sort of cross this line? Now we're like, I hear Walter Cronkite's voice in my head. Now we're writing a business book. But no, they
Exactly.
softened it up.
Exactly. And Ken always says when you write straight nonfiction, the person reading it, their critic is right there, ready to argue with everything you're saying. But if you write a story, people just follow along and follow the story. And those talking points, those learning points just sneak in there.
I do know. And I know all too well. And I know in my book, sometimes people will say, I saw this, I read that, I like that. And every now and then they'll get the right one, meaning they were all important. I wouldn't put it there. But there were a few that were almost ground zero for me, very special, really began to, I shaped things around that. Can you tell me a story from your angle, that a story that moved you about Ken, or maybe began to trigger you in your own book?
Well, there are a lot of very, very moving stories in Ken's life. One I haven't told, but
Oh,
that's really incredible. Um, Ken's father retired as a rear admiral in the Navy and was one of his heroes. There are stories in the book about the kind of leadership lessons his father taught him. But like so many of that generation, he was a smoker and he developed lung cancer. And I think Ken was on a training somewhere and he got the news that his dad's health was failing, and he went to the hospital, and it was clearly toward the end. And Ken spent time with his dad. His dad was a really funny guy. And then he did something when he left for the day. he pulled out a tape. He used to always carry, you remember those cassette tape recorders that
Oh yeah.
people used to have? This is old technology for those listeners who don't remember this. There was a day before the iPhone people actually had to carry these little implements, but he took his cassette tape recorder and he made a tape for his father, just telling his dad all the wonderful things that he did and the difference he made in his life, and what an incredible father he was, and what an incredible husband he was, and what an incredible leadership role model. And he just poured his heart out into this tape. And then he took it back to the nurse and he said, when my dad wakes up, will you hand him this and see if he can listen to it? And he left for the day. And in the middle of the night, he got a phone call that his father had passed away. And he, of course, started crying. And then he said to the nurse, I gave my dad a tape recorder with a tape in it. Did he listen to that message? And she said, over and over and over again. And to me, that story is just classic Ken Blanchard catching someone doing something right. You don't have to just use this in a business space. This is about the people in our lives,
Yeah.
taking time to acknowledge them.
Yeah, and let's put a pin in that right there. I think that's really important because I'd like to think that in the conversations we have here, we have things that where people are listening can not just hear the story you just told, but maybe create something of their own. And Martha, I was blessed and lucky enough to have kind of figured that out a couple years before my dad passed. Not with a tape recorder, but with an actual document that I created. I called it his marks and the different marks that he'd left on the planet. And my dad was, I think, 88. And so I came up with 89, one to grow on. And I framed it. I'm getting emotional talking about it, but I framed it, put it up there. And I'm very pleased with the fact that he was able to look at it. It always made me emotional. I didn't know it would make me emotional talking about it, but it always made me emotional looking at it. But I think that's something that we should all do for a father, a mother, a loved one. I wish more people would do that.
Rob, all I can say is great minds think alike. And so you and Ken Blanchard are spiritual brethren. Let me tell you that. And I hope that this conversation inspires a few people to do the same for their parents. No matter what kind of job your parent did, they're just human beings, and they need love and encouragement as much as anyone. Somebody once asked Ken, who needs encouragement? And he said, everybody who's breathing. We all need to cheer each other on because life is tough. Let's face it, life is not easy.
Yeah, it isn't. And don't overthink it either. The marks, in my opinion, some of those marks were you took me to a drive-in. You took me to the circus, you taught me to ride a bike. These are marks. So they're there and there's plenty of them. And believe me, you'll come up with 80, 90, 100. There is plenty of them out there. So I love that idea. I'm really glad you brought that up and got me going on a little bit. Now let me compose myself and continue the conversation like a professional podcaster. Now let's talk about catching people doing things right, which I happen to love because I do work with managers and I'm always stressing without putting those words to it. Why is it that we have managers that simply they can't even provide positive feedback? They're looking, we know when we get called into the manager's office, we're all holding our breath. Why can't we have a manager who calls us into the office to catch us doing something right? So talk about that a little bit, if you would.
Well, okay, the first thing, why can't we have managers who catch us doing things right? The first thing is let's give ourselves a break. Let's give managers a break. We're all kind of programmed to catch people doing things wrong. And here's why. We survived as a species by surveying our environment and seeing what was going wrong and jumping on it before it killed us, right? So we're kind of hardwired to find out what's going wrong and fix it. That's just in our DNA. So we have to override that conditioning to catch people doing things right. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is some leaders are under the impression that it's all about them and their performance. And they don't understand what really motivates people. But a lot of times they're just trying to prove their their efficiency and their value. And if they haul someone in and make them straighten up and fly right, they're doing their job as a manager. And so it's really shifting that mindset to, leadership is not just about catching people doing things wrong. It's about setting the vision and values and then helping people to achieve that purpose, whatever your goal is. So
Yeah,
it's really about turning the focus away from self and turning it on to people.
I agree with you. And yet, here's a book I'll never write. Wonderful title. You ready? It's called Instinct versus Logic. Okay. What you just said is very logical. I'm not going to argue with you, but it's not instinctive. So we either need to read a book, we need to be reminded, but I wish that it was more instinctive.
I do
And that,
too.
yeah. And that's
I
why I
do
even
too.
fall to that feedback model, Martha, of just even teaching people to just, how about just balance your feedback? No matter who we're talking to. If you've got a superstar, if you've got somebody who's really struggling, we can still balance that feedback. That's how the superstar got there. They want the balance fee. They don't want to just be praised. They want to figure out what they can do better. And the other people and people who struggle, we want to develop that talent. We don't want to beat them up. But again, logical, just not instinctive.
Exactly. And so Ken always says it may be common sense, but it's not common practice. But to get to your point, of course, I don't want to oversimplify it. Catch
Yeah.
people doing things right. It's not just saying, yay, attaboy, attagirl, and ignoring all the issues, right? There's a way to praise people that's effective. And for what you do is you see what they're doing right. You tell them what they did right. You tell them how that made you feel, and you praise them for that. It's not all of management. You were talking a little bit about the different levels of performance of a team, and that's another thing Ken developed with Dr. Paul Hersey back when he was at the University of Ohio. He and Dr. Paul Hersey developed something called situational leadership. And eventually, Ken split off and developed his own concept called SL2, which is slightly different. But the idea is that the leader assesses and diagnoses where the person is in their development level on a certain task and then tailors their leadership style to that person. Maybe they need direction. Maybe they are a beginner and they need more direction. Maybe they're a little bit better and they just need encouragement and coaching. Maybe they're a total achiever and all they need is more challenges. And that's so you have to tailor your leadership style to that person.
Yeah. What I like also is a process. I don't know if you know the backstory on Jollis here, but I'm a former Xerox guy. We refer to ourselves as Zeroids. So I'm a proud card carrying X, bleeding blood X is a Zeroid. But we always had processes. That's what I loved about the company because I hadn't been taught that way. And I loved kind of repeatable and predictable processes, something that I could practice and measure and determine whether I was improving or not. So I think what you're beginning to do right now is you're sort of laying out a process for this concept within the book. What not concerns me about your process, what I want people to recognize is I didn't hear in that process, gee, now if you could only improve this part of your performance, we'd really be hitting a home run and pulling that praise away, which is a common issue. How do we stop people from doing that?
Oh, I think it's just asking people to become self aware, asking leaders to become self aware, and really taking a look at their leadership. And, leaders, everybody needs training. We all can learn. And for leaders to not just jump into the job and think that they don't need training about how to be a better leader. So I think that's one thing. Listening to podcasts like yours, getting ideas about how to be a better leader, I think that's a great idea. So cheers to all you listeners listening to this and trying to improve your game. Yeah, Ken always talked about, the seagull manager who would fly in, make a lot of noise, dump on everybody and then fly out, and you certainly don't want to be one of those.
No.
So even if you're doing leadership wrong, at least you're working with your people. Now, up your game, right?
Yeah. And don't be afraid to read a leadership book or two because quite frankly, one of the processes that's broken, in my opinion, I'd love to hear your view on this, is that we still seem to be stubborn about really training our leaders. We see people that can sell a widget more than anyone else, or do a task faster than anyone else, and say, you know what? Now you're a leader. Now you're a
That
manager.
that
But
yeah,
where's the formalized training that comes behind that?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Rob, because that's what keeps happening. They'll find an outstanding performer who's very good at their individual contribution, and then they'll suddenly put them into a leadership role. And leadership roles are really about people. It's about working with people and loving them and loving their mission and getting out of the way so that your people can be great. And that doesn't come naturally. That's something you have to learn how to do. You have to learn how to have those constructive conversations with people and how to have those one-on-one meetings with people.
Right. And the trainer in me even says we do this because even if we're working with people who are unconsciously competent, which is, if you ever heard of the 4 levels of conscious behavior, we trainers love to drag that one out of the closet now and then. But the unconscious competent for others means people who are doing things right, but they don't even know they're doing things right. Who's to say they'll keep doing those things correctly? So whether we've got somebody who's a superstar and we can just let them, put a name on what they're doing, or show people who are what we call unconsciously incompetent. They don't know that they don't know. It's not malicious. They just don't know. But that's why trainers exist, corporate trainers exist, and books exist, and processes exist. So, because it's not intuitive to just wake up and be a great leader or a great manager.
No, it's not. And getting back to the 1 minute manager, I remember I had an early leadership role when I read that book. And to me, it was a revelation that you could actually have, you know, kind of a personal relationship with your direct report. I had this idea in my head because I had been brought up with that top-down leadership
Right.
authoritarian sort of point of view of what a leader is. And, when Ken Blanchard introduced this side-by-side leadership, it was really a revelation to me. And it's leadership is something you do with people, not to people. That was just so extraordinary to me. And more, I see that really is the best way to manage people.
Yeah. My dad had a saying, he was our Boy Scout leader. But we had a troop that went from 7 boys to 120 boys in less than 2 years. So we were quite the troop. And he had this motto for leaders, and he said, it's not go on and do it, it's come on, let's do it. And that was something he would preach to us, and it was sort of our mantra of okay, even for a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, we were learning some of the most important concepts, which was just because we were a leader doesn't give us the authority to be a dictator. And we'll leave politics out of this for today. We just, the bottom line is, again, not intuitive. We need books, instructors, we need help to validate what we're doing. And I'm just so glad you wrote this book. It's really
I love
important.
that. I love that story about the Cub Scouts, was it?
It
Yeah.
was a Boy Scouts.
Boy Scouts. Okay. So Ken actually, he used to be a professor at the University of Massachusetts before he was a best-selling author and the co-founder of a global leadership training organization. He was started as a university professor. But during those days, somebody came to the Blanchard's door, a woman in the neighborhood, and asked Ken's wife, Margie, if she wanted to be a den mother. And she said, well, I don't have time. I'm working on my PhD, but my husband might be interested. So Ken, who was teaching at the time, he was teaching and had PhD students, but he wanted to be a den mother, or which was, and he taught those kids. He brought the parents in, and that was one of his. That's actually a place where a lot of people start to learn leadership.
Yep.
And then the other thing is that when Ken, you're talking about what leadership really is, Ken learned that lesson early on. I talked about his father, the rear admiral in the Navy. When Ken was in seventh grade, he was a popular kid and he won the presidency of the seventh grade. And he was all excited. He went running home to tell his mom and dad, Mom, Dad, I'm president of the class now, beating his chest. And his dad took him aside and said, Son, that is great. Really happy that you did that. Good job. Now, let me tell you a lesson about leadership. Now that you've got the presidency label, don't ever use it because
Mm.
people follow leaders not because they have a title, but because people love, trust, and respect them. So just be the kind of guy that people want to follow. And
Wow.
that just stuck with him. It's not
Unbelievable.
about the title, you
Yeah,
know?
no, what a great story. Let's talk. I want to talk about you a little bit. This isn't your first book, right?
Not at all, no.
Not at all. That's not your first rodeo. How many books do we have under our belt there?
Well, I wrote a series of mystery novels way
Uh-huh.
back in the 1990s.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a couple of life experiences that were quite dramatic. I was raped by a serial rapist who broke into my house and raped me. Uh, to close the loop on that one, the police caught him a year later and he was convicted. It was one of many, many, many crimes this person had done. So, anyway, that introduced me to the criminal justice system. Then I also had a former fiance who stalked me for 2 years. So I had quite a bit of interaction with police officers and district attorneys and all that, and really got to know. And they say, write what you know. Well, I think as a way to sort of process all that was happening to me, I wrote a series of mystery novels featuring a private investigator who solved crimes and put bad guys away. And what happened was after 9/11, I decided I didn't want to write stories about bad guys anymore and evildoers and catching people doing things wrong. I really wanted to make a difference. And it was right around that time that I found out that Ken Blanchard needed an executive editor to help him on his book projects. And, you know, here's a man who the American Management Association said was one of the top leadership authorities of the century. I had admired Ken for decades at that point. Decades at that point? Yeah, a couple decades at that point. And I just jumped at the chance to do that. So Ken and I worked on a book with Ken called Trustworks, which you mentioned in
Right.
the introduction. So this is actually my one, two, three, four, five, six, seventh book.
Wow. Well, congratulations. We're tied. I'm,
We're
I'm at
tied. Yes.
seven too. Now
Tell
I
me
got to
about
write an eighth because Martha's got seven. All right. Well, I needed a kick. Thanks for that. Uh,
tell me
you,
about the book
yeah,
that Ken. Tell me about the book that Ken endorsed of yours because
okay.
I might be familiar with it.
The book is called How to Change Minds, The Art of Influence Without Manipulation. It was
Oh, I
my
love that.
attempt as a sales trainer. I was tired of looking at everyone and going cross-eyed, going, but we all sell. But you're a parent, you're on the PTA,
Yeah.
we all sell. And
Yeah.
so I thought, well, maybe we need a book that takes dollar signs off the cover and stops telling people how much you're going to make and talks about the moral implications of one of the greatest things you can do for a human being, which is help them pass their fear of change. Maybe that's putting alcohol down or putting that cigarette away. Or other things that are really morally very important. So that was a sort of a departure for me, who was really kind of in the trenches teaching sales teams, and it opened up a population of nurses and doctors and laboratories and all sorts of people were willing to have a conversation about persuasion, but not with the card carrying, sell you book. And so that was the book that Ken endorsed.
I love it. Just based on the title alone, that's a Ken Blanchard type book, because it's not about it's about how can I add value to you,
Right, right.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, and I'm a big fan of Brian Tracy, and Brian was kind enough to also write an endorsement, and his first endorsement was, "If you want to make money and lots of it, read this book." And I had to sheepishly crawl back and go, "I'm so grateful and blessed." But I can't use that one. And then he looked at it more carefully because he's also really a wonderful guy and said, "Oh, I get it now." And then we went. But that's how important it was. Even the cover is actually just a cat and a mouse. There's no business. It's a cat looking straight ahead and the mouse looking sideways, and there's a conversation going on, and it's an important one. So, but
Nice.
anyway, I don't want to talk about me. I want about how dare you? How dare that? Very very smooth of you to swing it over. I want to swing back to you. How's the book doing?
Well, the book is available for pre-order right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so we don't, we don't know yet. It's available wherever books are sold
Okay.
or marthalawrence.com.
Mhm.
But yeah, we are right now I don't know when this podcast will air, but
Okay.
right now as we're taping, it's early September, mid-September. So the book will be out October 21st.
That's what I'm looking for. October
Yeah.
21st. Well, it really won't matter when this airs because even if the book isn't out, my audience is shrewd enough to understand how important pre-orders are. So
Yes.
whenever you hear this podcast, go jump onto Amazon. Let's get some pre-orders going on this book because it's just too important, and it matters. It matters to authors, and it matters to the almighty algorithm, etc. So let's get on this book and let's take care of that. Do we have a big book launch prepared?
We have a book launch event that will happen in San Diego on the
Okay.
23rd, and we have
Okay.
lots of stuff lined up. And I just want to say that for listeners, really it's a book that is if you're a speaker, if you're an author, if you're someone who has your own business, it's really the story of how someone can go through all that. And Ken was told in college that he couldn't write. Okay, basically, they all his professors said you're going to perish because you can't publish. You're not a good writer. And yet he went on to co-author The 1 Minute Manager, which is one of the best-selling business books of all time. By his own admission, he couldn't even balance his own checkbook. The story of how his company started is he was a very gifted speaker, and he was on sabbatical from his professorship and was invited to speak to the Young Presidents Organization. And he gave 3 talks. The first day he had a small audience. Second day he had a much larger audience. Third day, basically the whole conference came to hear him speak. And when he was done, the audience leapt to its feet, thunderous applause. 5 of the presidents came and said, Blanchard, what are you doing after this? And he said, I'm going to go back to the university and teach. And they said, no, you're not. You've got to start your own company. When you're hot, you're hot. And he said, I can't even balance my own checkbook. How am I going to start my own company? And they said, we'll help you. So for anyone the book is really for anyone who wants to read the story, be encouraged by the story of how someone could live a life the way Ken Blanchard lived it, really caring about others and yet succeed.
What a lovely story, and also inspirational for so many people who are listening, maybe it's writing, maybe it's something else, have been told that, that's something that you can't do, or that's something you can't do well. I don't want to crowbar myself in, but it might be something else that he and I share because I actually worked for a company when I was in my early 20s. And there were only 7 of us, and it was a training contract. And they loved me as a trainer, but I kept telling them I'm not a writer, I'm a trainer. And when the contract was up, they only had to get rid of one person, and it was me. And I thought I was coming in for another. I was called into my manager's office. I went, oh, another letter of recommendation and praise. These things are getting old. And I went in, and there was a whole party in there. It was HR, all sorts of people, and I was informed that I had 2 weeks because I wasn't a writer. And after I got done feeling sorry for myself, I signed up for a couple of writing classes, and I'm very proud of the books that I write as well. But I think that's not uncommon. Sometimes we need a little kick in the tail, or sometimes, because I believe in the Wizard of Oz, maybe Dorothy didn't have to go through all of that. Maybe he could have just explained it to her. Sometimes we just need a story like yours. Or maybe a little bit of mine too, to remind people that just because you're told you can't do it or you're not good at it doesn't mean you can't work hard and succeed. And that's what we're hearing here.
Exactly. And that you go through a stage. You're an enthusiastic beginner, and then you get your coaching, reach out to mentors. There's so much help available, for anyone who wants to improve in any area. Now, everything is available on the internet. There's really no excuse to stay stuck, right, Rob?
That's correct. And don't let people tell you you can't do this, you can't do that. it's so enjoyable when you say, "Are you sure about that?" Because look what I just did. And so maybe use that as motivation rather than discouragement. Yeah. What a wonderful conversation with you. How do people get a hold of you, Martha?
Again, you can take a look at my website, which is marthalawrence.com. I also would love people to take a look at kenblanchardbooks.com. Ken is the author of 70 books.
Mm, he's got his
And
beat.
there is something for every situation in leadership. He has really written the gamut. And there's so many. And, his mom used to tell him, Ken, I notice you always write books with a co author. Why do you always write books with a co author? Don't you want your name in big letters on the cover? And it's so classic for Ken not to do that because he doesn't have a big ego. And he said, Mom, one of my big values is learning. I already know what I know. If I work with a co author, I'm going to learn a lot and I'm going to have fun. So he has partnered with people who have expertise in all kinds of areas. So kenblanchardbooks.com. And then if you're a manager who's interested in training, blanchard.com has got everything from individual, self-directed training to giant corporations who need major training initiatives. So blanchard.com.
All right, you got it all in, and that works for me. Listen, if you listen, and we're almost on our, I think, our 500th show now. You don't hear me fawn over people like I do Ken Blanchard. That's not my style. I'll tell it like it is. Extraordinary person. I have not been blessed with shaking his hand yet. I want to meet him someday. I've had conversations with lots of people who are having conversations with him, and we move back and forth. But someday I'm going to actually meet this man. But I feel like I already have, particularly with the conversation that I had today, and I'm really grateful for it. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Rob. And where are you located?
I'm in right outside of Washington, D.C.
Washington, D.C. Well, let's see. Ken just came back from New York. He's got homes in New York and California. But if I could help make that happen, I'd be happy
Well,
to.
and I'll come up to New York. He doesn't have to come to DC. That's not too far. I'll jump on a train. No big deal there. That would be wonderful. Any case, I wish you so much success with this book. Sounds terrific. I get publicists that say, "Ooh, we'll send you a copy," and I always go, "No, no, no," because for two reasons. One, I, I think I want to have a verified review on the book. And if you give me a book, I can't do it. And two, I think it's just a nice thing to do for the author. I'll be getting this particular book. So I'm really looking forward to it. And so plan on hearing from me because I'm going to read it and then I'm going to get back to you on it. Wonderful, wonderful meeting you, Martha. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Rob. It was wonderful chatting.
You bet. Well, we'll do it again as well as we can next time, everybody. Until then, stay safe.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please rate and recommend it on iTunes, Outcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also get more information on this show and Rob at jollis.com.